Thanks for joining us today. I see there might be some people who are continuing to come on with us, but we're going to get started because we do have a packed agenda for you. We just wanted to start with just a quick introduction. My name is Carrie Whipple. I work with the Southeast Education Cooperative, and some of my roles there center around literacy. So this kind of journey to the science of reading and more of the structured literacy approach is something that we have been working towards and really started on in earnest right about when COVID hit in the spring. And so we've got some projects we've been working on this fall around some grants, the CLSD grant, the dyslexia grant. We're helping with some of those things for some of our schools, as well as a really exciting professional development cohort called LETRS, L-E-T-R-S. And we do have a page that we'll share with you at our SEEK website where we keep up to date on some of our literacy initiatives. So after Erica introduces herself here, she'll put that in the web. Oh, she already did in the chat for us. Thanks, Erica. Go ahead.
Hi, everybody. I'm Erica Kingdom. I'm in my third year with Reading Corps. Reading Corps, we work to leverage the power of national service with the science of reading. So I will be here today supporting Carrie and putting links and resources into the chat as Carrie guides us through our content. And on a personal level too, I'm very passionate about the science of reading as some of my own children are challenged with reading. And so it's that social emotional connection is really what drives my passion. So thanks everybody for being here today.
Thanks, Erica. So I'm going to take the first quote here and just read it for the group. This first quote, "The Science of Reading," comes from Dr. Louisa Moats, and she says, "The body of work referred to as a science of reading is not an ideology, a philosophy, a political agenda." Whew, thank goodness, right? We can't use that any more of that right now. "A one-size-fits-all approach, a program of instruction, nor a specific component of instruction. It is the emerging consensus from many related disciplines, based on literally thousands of studies, supported by hundreds of millions of research dollars conducted across the world in many languages. These studies have revealed a great deal about how we learn to read, what goes wrong when students don't learn, and what kind of instruction is most likely to work the best for the most students." Erica, do you want to read the other quote?
Yes, so this comes from Dr. Mark Seidenberg, where he says, "The body of basic research in developmental psychology, educational psychology, cognitive science, and cognitive neuroscience on reading, one of the most complex human behaviors in its biological, meaning neural and genetic basis. This research has been conducted for decades in the US and around the world. The research has important implications for helping children to succeed, but has not been incorporated in how teachers are trained for the job or how children are taught."
What we'd like to do, just to solidify our thinking around what does it mean when we say the science of reading, what is the definition of the science of reading, we'd like you to use the chat and choose a word or phrase that really stands out from one of these quotes. So anything that resonates with you, go ahead and start typing in the chat. We'll give it just a second. I see thousands of studies, complex, consensus from many disciplines. Thanks, guys. Not an ideology, not one size fits all. There's a biological basis to it. It is complex. In fact, reading is actually, it is rocket science, right? And there was an article that was recently released that talks about that. Erica's going to put the link in the chat for us. We also do have a document in Canvas for you that has all of the links that we'll talk about today. So don't worry about trying to capture them from the chat, but if you wanted to click on one as we visit, you sure can do that as well. So what we know about this body of research is it's not like a brand new thing, right? This isn't like the new and cool thing. This is actually something that's been going on for many years, right? So our objectives with our time today, with our remaining about 42 minutes, is thinking about and being able to explain what the science of reading means. We're going to have you do some look-fors. I know quite a few of you are in roles where you may be an administrator, a literacy coach, someone who might do walkthroughs. And so we're going to show you some tools that could be used to really leverage that science of reading when you're in your school and doing the work in your school. And then we're going to have you make a little plan about how you're going to share your knowledge when you leave here today. Okay? So we're going to start with this ladder of reading. And what this ladder really shows us that if we look at the very top of the ladder, that 5% of kids that, you know, seems like no matter what we do, they'd learn to read anyway. They might even come to us reading before they even get to school, right? They're going to be advantaged by a structured literacy approach, as will the 35% of kids who it's relatively easy for them to read. But we've got another 40 to 50% of kids where learning to read is really complex. They really need systematic and explicit instruction to be able to do this. And 10 to 15% who may be categorized as dyslexic, so they require an explicit, sequential kind of instruction for reading. And so we can see here that there are certain groups of kids for which we have to do structured literacy in a very explicit way, but everyone benefits from it. And so that's really what we want to take from here, that we do have, you know, 40% of kids who will basically learn to read no matter what kind of approach we use. But we know as educators, like 40% just doesn't feel right. It's not good enough, right? And if we look further into our statewide data, if we took a look at third grade reading, we can see that we have approximately 48% of kids. So we're maybe doing a little bit better than that national graphic. And if we look side by side, we can see that even though we're doing a little bit better with our top two categories, when it comes right down to it, more than half of our kids still aren't proficient by third grade in reading, and that just doesn't sit well with us. And so really, like, what can we do about it? And this is where I think a lot about, like, my background. I got a master's in reading education. You know, I should know some of this, and I'm still learning every day. So we hope that you learn with us today. One of the things that we learned about, actually the last week before COVID and everything shut down, Eric and I were fortunate to attend a National Reading Corps meeting, and one of the presenters there talked about implementation science. And this was the first graphic she showed us. Her name is Dr. Lisa Sinetti, and she told us about this like white paper research to classroom practice kind of a gap. And what she said was, it takes 17 years in education for 14% of the research to get into practice. And I hope you're going like, that's really bad. that's not good enough, right? And so there's some good news. And so we'll continue to look at this research gap over the course of our time together today. And we'll tell you what you can do about it to speed that up a little bit. But we know that, you know, having half our kids not proficient in reading, that's not good enough. And taking 17 years to just get a tiny bit of research into practice, also not good enough. So we know we have work to do. So this is just a graphic that shows us. We have research on the one side, and that's what we know about the fields from neuroscience and cognitive science, and advances in technology. We actually have been able to use functional MRIs to watch the blood flow in the brain, and we can see what happens as we have more connections, as we become more skilled readers, as that teaching and learning occurs. On the other side of the span here, we have our classrooms, and always in the middle, we have those educators who are stretching themselves way too thin to do the best that they can for the students they serve. And so we can do better because we know better. And this is an area where we want to be really careful because, like I said, I have my master's in reading, and during COVID, as I'm pulling things off of the bookshelves around me here, I'm looking through and I'm seeing a lot of theories that I was taught that were just theories, and they weren't based on cognitive science. They weren't based on research. And so even though it felt like I brought a lot of knowledge to this body of research in my learning about the science of reading, I'm doing a lot of relearning. And so we really want to be sure that we handle this very carefully with teachers. These are the kinds of things that they were taught about reading instruction, and so we need to just tweak our thinking a little bit about our practices. In fact, when we look at the 5 big areas of reading that were in the National Reading Panels report in the year 2000. We can see phonemic awareness, phonics, fluency, vocabulary, and comprehension. We've known about these 5 big areas, you know, for 20 years now, and we still have, you know, only a small amount of time in our teacher education programs that are preparing teachers for teaching some of these areas. In fact, I have a close family member who just completed her first year of teaching in a classroom. She was a 3rd grade teacher, and her one big aha for the year was, oh my gosh, I can't believe how unprepared I was to teach reading and writing to kids. I had no idea how little I knew about how to actually deliver that kind of instruction. So even, you know, in our local colleges here, we're not doing enough to prepare our teachers to really be able to do this really well. All right, we do have an activity here for you. So in order to shift our thinking about what effective literacy might look like, we have a graphic here for you, and Erica's going to put a link so you can pull it up on your computer if you want to see this in bigger print. What I'd like you to do is read through the 2 sides of this T-chart. One is talking about more typical literacy, or what we might call balanced literacy practices. And on the other side is structured literacy, of what we might call science of reading practices. And so I've got just a little assignment for you on the slide here. I would like you to find either a question, a validation, or a noticing, and you'll code that in the chat by either starting with a Q and a colon, a V and a colon, or an N and a colon. So I'm going to play a little music, and I'll give you a minute or 2 to look at this link, look at this information, and tell us, what do you see here? What's a question you have, a validation, or a noticing? Just a few things I'm noticing from the chat. Questions about phonics. That comes up a lot, about having a structured phonics program. We'll talk more about that in a couple minutes. Big difference from what I was taught when I was in a teacher prep program. Really interesting noticing our current way of teaching reading is not perfect for all students, but it is really great for the ones who already have the skills needed to be successful. I like that one. Some people are talking about active learning being with the science of reading. I'm seeing some things about the error correction. Yep, and there is within balanced literacy, I think that's a term that can be used in a lot of different ways, and different groups have defined it a little bit differently. And so there are some people who would say that they're balanced literacy, and they have been doing phonemic awareness, right? And then I'm also seeing, again, more about phonemic awareness, more about phonics, and about the silent reading. That's an interesting one, isn't it? Especially for our students who are just learning to read. We really have to think about the read to self time. Somebody's mentioning daily 5 in here. Read to self is really hard when you can't read yet. So, you know, what might we be seeing in behaviors? What might we be seeing students actually, what can students do who can't read yet in that read to self? And so those are the questions we're currently exploring with our letters cohort as we learn more about the science of reading, is how to really think about the structures that might be working. Maybe the daily 5 structure itself is working. Maybe it's the activities we do in the small groups that we need to be tweaking, right? You guys are having really great questions in here. A lot about, I'm seeing some things about what does this mean for older students? So some of the things we'll talk about here have to do with emerging readers. And the reality is that no matter what grade you teach, you might have students who are lacking some of the skills that we talk about when we're building that base. So there is something here for all of you. You can keep writing in the chat, and I'm going to keep moving in our slides here so we can dig further into this. simple view of reading is really one of the first big bases that we think about and learn about when we're learning about the science of reading. And really what that comes down to, oh gosh, Vince, I just took that slide out because I just wasn't sure there would be enough people here about ELs. But we can talk later and I can share that other slide with you. So what we know that kids need in order to have that product of reading comprehension is they need that strong decoding background and they also need that language comprehension. And we know that you can be strong in decoding and not so strong yet in language comprehension, or strong in language comprehension, but maybe you don't have those decoding skills yet, right? And so we know that we do have some learners that fall on either end of the strong and weak when it comes to the decoding. You could be strong or weak in decoding, you could be strong or weak in language comprehension. And one of those quadrants, you're right, Vince, is kind of where English learners fall in. They might have the decoding skills, but they maybe don't have the language comprehension yet to be able to fully have that full piece of that reading comprehension. I'm glad you asked that question. When it comes to the simple view of reading, this is really a piece that helps us when we have some of these other tools, because it's really nice to be able to categorize some of the reading skills into either that decoding bucket or that language comprehension bucket. So the next thing we're going to look at is a tool that you might use. It was developed for early elementary, but we see that there could be many uses all the way up through, especially Vince, when you put it that way, really thinking about those English learner classes, even middle school and high school, some of those reading classes you might have middle school and high school that are MTSS, alternate core kinds of classes. We see this tool could be utilized very well in some of those classes, and maybe you can just pick the parts that make the most sense for you, but we'll jump into that. So this curriculum evaluation tool is something that is put out by the Reading League. And they are kind of some of our go-to when it comes to where we get our materials that are really nice, that make sense for us, that can be used in classrooms. Another piece that you'll see on this slide is the reading rope. We don't have time to go into all the skills on the reading rope, but the reading rope is basically looking at those sub skills within decoding and those sub skills within language comprehension and pulling those apart even further, so that when we're starting to see that a student has an issue with reading, which are the strands of the rope that we need to fortify? Which are the ones that we could help with interventions? Are we even assessing all the strands? And so those are some of the questions that we ask. Okay, so the first part of this curriculum evaluation tool really talks about phonological and phoneme awareness. And so if you're not familiar with phonological and or phoneme awareness, one example of an activity that you might do in this area. I know some of you are putting in that you've started with Heggerty and some of you are doing Pathways to Reading. I know those have a strong phonemic awareness component, and maybe some of your other programs and materials that you use also do. But an example, if you're unfamiliar, would be say the word wrote. And I'm going to have you actually do this. I know it sounds silly speaking to your computer, right? Say the word wrote. Now say it again, but don't say t. And if you can think of what word that would be, you can type it in the chat. I'm used to a little more interaction, so I'm okay with that. I'm going to give you one more. Good. Row. How about say the word rack? Now say it again, but instead of ack, say ib. And we've got rib, good. So some of those are the more advanced kind of phonemic awareness activities that we want to do with isolating a sound, manipulating that sound, maybe substituting the sound. And so we really want to get our learners thinking about the sounds in words. It really helps with the reading piece, but guess what that also helps with on the other side, right? The encoding piece. So we've got the decode and the encoding together. Now, phonemic awareness is an activity we want to do with our eyes closed. We don't want to do with the letters in front of us, but very quickly then we move to phonics, and that's where we do start to add those letters in. my note about phonics really is that it seems like when I talk to most teachers, they'll say that they have this really great curriculum resource that they use, you know, this nationally, you know, known kind of curriculum resource, but they say, you know what, it just doesn't have much for phonics. And so this is an area you'll notice in the green flags in this walkthrough or curriculum evaluation tool. The green flags here really talk about systematic, really talk about explicit. So I feel like when teachers are telling me like the phonics, like there's not enough phonics or there's not enough phonemic awareness in their curriculum resource, what they're really saying is that the instruction in those areas is not explicit, and it might not be very sequential, or maybe it's unclear that it's sequential. And so there's a question in the chat about leveled readers. There is a lot of information about leveled readers versus decodable readers in the Science of Reading community. And I don't know that we'll have time to get all the way into that today, but you should stay after or email me and we can talk about it. All right, so just as an example of phonics, since we haven't done much explicit instruction in this language that you see on your screen, what I'd like you to do is see if you can type in the chat what this sentence says. Or even just the first word. You can just do the first word if you want. I see some people who are starting with the letters D-I-H. One thing I forgot to tell you, maybe I wasn't very explicit, is that in this language you actually read from right to left. So those of you who are writing the word D-I-H, that was actually the last word. We do have one person who figured the code out. So the last word in the sentence you write is hid. The first word is kit. Kit, you're right, Jim. The first word is kit. Kit, you're right. Kit ran and hid. So you did very well based on the knowledge that you had about how language systems work. But you can see how when we're not explicit and systematic, when we just put these kind of letters up in front of kids, they might not make a whole lot of sense to them. In fact, we did an activity last week with some teachers where we talked about what the letter names, like the name of the letter W. Actually, if we did things based on letter names instead of letter sounds, we might see that kids are really confused by that. Like they might think that words that start with W, actually, we write them with W, right? And so you can see why it's so important. Reading is rocket science. This is not something that's natural to us as humans. Oral language is, but reading is something that really needs to be taught. And we know through our MTSS work, we know through our intervention work, that systematic and explicit are really where it's at when it comes to this type of instruction. Next, this tool leads us to that pillar from the NRP report about fluency. And what we'll see on the green flags and the red flags from this slide, we're not just looking for rate. We're also looking for accuracy. We're looking for expression. One of the things that we'll see here too is that in the red flag area for fluency, there are some programs and some teaching practices that would allow for an incorrectly decoded word as long as the student kind of got the gist of the passage or kind of was getting to that next level, that comprehension level, which is what we want the product of reading to be. But we have to be sure that we're doing that explicit error correction as well. If I read frog and it's really toad, we need to be sure that I know how to decode the word ode, right? That I understand that. And so in some programs, and this is something just to watch for, in some programs, in some practices, it's really all about more about the gist and the comprehension piece than the actual did you decode the word. And so this is where your question kind of comes in about decodables. There are two groups of books for early readers. One would be like a decodable set of books, and one would be more of a predictable text. And what they say about the predictable text is that you may not need to be able to decode the words. You might not have to decode the words to be able to read a predictable text. You might be able to really make good guesses and have the gist of it and feel like you're reading and look like you're reading. There's a really, should I say it, Erica? She's going to say, I don't know. Yes, I should say it. If you want to look up the Purple Reading Challenge on Facebook or on YouTube, there's 2 videos that really show this in action when a student has a predictable text about the word purple. So different things are purple as she turns the pages. And then when the mom goes to cover up the pictures and the child tries to read the words, she has much more trouble, of course. But then she does a second video on how to decode the word purple. And once she teaches her how to read the word purple, how she can read maybe even without that picture cue support. And so it's really an interesting video, and I encourage you to go find that one on Facebook. I'll make sure that we get an updated Word document with all our links on it that has those for you. And then this tool goes further into the language comprehension side, which this goes back a little bit to Vince's question as well. Asking about English learners, and we know that English learners might have very different background knowledge coming to school than some of our other students. And so it's really important that we build that background knowledge, and there's good to see there's some green flags to look for in this area, as well as vocabulary instruction. And if you've done the project with Dr. Kevin Feldman, that he's done in many places across the state, the academic language project. We do talk a lot about, we have a whole series on the vocabulary instruction piece. And what this comes down to is, you know, really thinking about which tier 2 words need to be taught explicitly, for example, using that FRAIR model, and also getting into morphology. When we look at something like this slide, when we've got that definition, but we also get into the morphology of the word, we get into where the words come from, kids can build their knowledge of words based on the roots and the suffixes and the affixes that we have on words. The more they know about morphology. And so our vocabulary instruction, you know, the green flags of the vocabulary instruction really talk about those tier 2 words that are explicitly taught, choosing a few, not having, you know, 40 terms for this chapter, you know, but really focusing on a few words a day that we're going to be really explicit about teaching. And then also getting into like a discussion about the morphology and what parts of those words mean. For students so that they can start to build their own word bank and learn more words. It's also important in this area to really be thinking about that grammar piece, that language structure piece, verbal reasoning. Some of that discussion is really in there. When I think about the Common Core standards and the shift to more oral language, I really see that verbal reasoning piece play out here in the green. And then just literacy knowledge. So again, thinking about my English learner background, the literacy knowledge piece really comes in for those content area teachers. And are we teaching kids that the language of science really does look different than the language of social studies? One is much more of a passive voice, one might be more of a narration, right? And so how that text looks and how we approach that text, how we approach a text for social studies might be reading the caption on a picture, which is very different than reading a graph or a chart in science or math. And so just having those things pointed out and explained to kids so that we were explicitly teaching that genre, whether it's a genre within our language arts class or whether we're talking about the content areas and across the content areas. And then finally, we get to the product here of all that hard work, which is reading comprehension, and really having those look-fors of that comprehension strategy, that gradual release, that I do, we do, you do piece. Those are in the green flag area. And then we can't forget about writing. Eric and I were talking today, and as soon as we know the things about literacy that we need to know and share with others, we know that writing comes next. So that is our natural next step as far as the things that we'll be working on and offering from our office. And then finally, there are some green flags and red flag information here about the kinds of assessment that you might need to collect to get the information that would lead you to who needs to be supported in some of these areas. And then last, just the overall instructional design of your literacy program. All right. I'm only 2 minutes off of my time, Erica. Good news. So when we think about this bridge, that's a lot of information about literacy that we just went through in the last 10 minutes, right? And when we think about that bridge from research to practice, we have to look for a minute at implementation science. That's really what's going to help us get from the white paper back to the classroom. We need more than 14%. We need more than less than 17 years. That's like way too long. So when we look at our graph here, if we just do as we've always been doing and let things happen, it's going to take that long. But there are some things that we can do to shorten that up, and we call making that happen. And the good news is we can get the making it happen down to 2 or 3 years from research to practice if we look at some of these implementation strategies. So what I'd like you to do is just take a look at these strategies that you see here and think about from your role in your school or in your agency, is there one of these implementation strategies that you can use to help bridge that knowledge to practice gap? We have a couple of ways that you might, if you picked distribute educational materials, or if you said that you're going to create a professional learning collaborative, this curriculum evaluation tool that we just looked at might be one of the ways. We do have another resource for you, and it's from a page called the Right to Read project. So the one thing that we haven't spent a lot of time talking about is how that that graph that we showed at the beginning about having about half of our kids not have the right kind of instruction to be able to read really becomes an equity issue. And so equity is something we've been talking about especially a lot lately, and we need to keep that on the front of our mind. And this Right to Read project really views this science of reading from an equity lens, and they have a lot of wonderful resources. The one that I'll point you to here is the discussion guide for At a Loss for Words. And I know that a lot of you might have listened to the podcast At a Loss for Words. It's by the reporter, the education reporter, Emily Hannaford, and she talks about the kind of the problem with the way we've been doing reading instruction and being set in our ways and not moving off, and how that's created some real issues for kids. There is a facilitator's guide, and basically the guide kind of walks you through when to stop and has some questions that you can ask if you wanted to listen to this podcast sort of as a small group, as a PLC, or as a staff. You could also put those questions into your learning management system if you had something like that locally. I think it would really start some great discussions in your district if you wanted to go in that direction. With our last few minutes, I just wanted to tell you about a couple of other resources that we had to put out and make available to you, and then we'll have just a couple minutes for questions. So the first set of resources we wanted to share is the link we shared earlier. The article is called Teaching Reading is Rocket Science by Dr. Louisa Moats. There's also another tool that goes a little bit further than the red and green flag tool, goes into a little bit more depth, and it's called Structured Literacy and Typical Literacy Practices. And so if you would want to take a look at that article, if your role was a literacy coach or a curriculum developer, or you were adopting a new ELA curriculum at this time, that might be something you want to look at, clicking on that article. There is a short video from Jan Hasbrook, and that's the Science of Reading overview, maybe about 45 or 50 minutes, really good baseline for if you'd like to learn more about this. And there is also a principal blog about the science of reading by Principal Ortiz. And so it's called Decoding Leadership. And so we've got the link for you for those. If you're looking for materials, if you're a teacher, Title I strategist, something like that, and you came here looking for materials, you will find some links to some materials here. When we do the MTSS training, we talk about the West Virginia phonics lessons. They were developed through a project with the Department of Education, so they are free and available online. The way you access them online is a whole lot of clicks. So one thing we did for you is we put them on our SharePoint site on our website so that you had to click a little bit less and you could get to them a little faster and download a whole file at a time. So we have that link for you. There's also free decodables that someone within the Science of Reading community did during COVID and put online that align with the Virginia phonics lesson. So if you're looking for decodable books to go with your phonics lessons, those are available, as well as some other resources here that you might like if you are more in the trenches as one of those teachers hanging across that span there. I'll have you check those resources out. And then we've got a few pages that we follow regularly. The Science of Reading Facebook page, the Reading League Facebook page, and the Evidence-Based Teaching of Literacy and more. So hopefully these are some resources that might be useful to you.